What is next for Dragon Ball Super? Akira Toriyama's death was a piece of news no one was ready for. 2024 was supposed to be the year for Dragon Ball fans, especially given that the 40th anniversary of the series was to be celebrated through releases such as Dragon Ball Daima and Sparking Zero. There were even plans for a whole new story arc within the Dragon Ball Super main storyline. But now everything has changed, and even though the main plans for the series seem to remain intact, it is pretty obvious that Akira Toriyama being gone will have a major impact on how the franchise works. So now it is definitely time to stop for a second and ask the following question: where does Dragon Ball go next from here? Whether it was part of the transition between the superhero arc and the main events regarding the Dragon Ball storyline, or as a consequence to Toriyama Sensei's death, the fact remains that Dragon Ball Super is, as of right now, in an indefinite hiatus. This implies that we will not be getting a new chapter for the manga next month, but also that it will probably take several months for the series to get back on its feet. If we look back, the most recent hiatus for the Dragon Ball Super manga took place between the time that the Granola arc ended and the superhero prequel started. 4 months in total was the time that the Dragon Ball Super manga was put on hold. Should we use this as a reference to interpret how long this new hiatus will be? More or less. Obviously, the 4 months mark seems a plausible reference regarding the minimum time we won't be getting new content for the Dragon Ball Super manga. Of course, they might surprise us and get back in action before that 4-month mark, but considering that we are dealing not only with the transition to a whole new arc, but also Akira Toriyama's death, it certainly looks like they will not be rushing anything at all. We also have to consider that when Dragon Ball Super took that 4-month break, the superhero arc had already been done in the movie version. Even if the Dragon Ball Super manga changed and expanded on some things, the challenge of creating the superhero manga version was nothing similar to creating the Moro or Granola story arcs. Therefore, considering that we were about to see the beginning of a whole new story arc, it wouldn't be crazy to say that a long break was planned beforehand. In the end, the transition began right at the same time that Akira Toriyama died, so it is hard to say how much that piece of news affected the schedule of the Dragon Ball Super manga, but still a long absence had most likely been already decided. Also, with Dragon Ball Daima premiering during the fall of 2024, the Dragon Ball Super manga could push for a kind of really long break since the Dragon Ball franchise will still have a series with regular content on air, even if it is an anime format. The thing is that Daima will now be even more relevant than it was probably originally envisioned. The reason being that Toriyama became more and more involved in time with the project, to the point that Daima is now a Toriyama vision, much like many other creations of his past. There are many manga series that go on hiatus for really long periods of time, and for many different reasons. Let's not forget that it took 20 whole years for Dragon Ball Super to happen after Dragon Ball Z ended back in 1995. Yes, Dragon Ball GT happened eventually, and due to Akio Ioku's decision-making, it seems likely that even if Dragon Ball Super manga took years to come back, something that shouldn't happen unless things really fell apart for Toyotaro and others involved with the manga, we would still get content in the form of video games and anime movies or even series. A manga franchise that recently suffered a similar situation to that of Akira Toriyama's death is Berserk. The manga by the late Kentaro Miura, considered one of the best dark fantasy tales and a massive influence for video games such as Elden Ring, was left at a loss when Miura died not so long ago. As a result, it took about a whole year for the family and the people in charge of the distribution of Berserk to decide what would happen with it, and yes, cancellation was even a possibility. In the end though, it was decided that Koji Muri, a friend to Miura-sensei and a professional mangaka as well as Studio Gaga, the team Kentaro Miura worked with to bring Berserk to life would be the ones in charge of keeping Berserk alive. In a way, a similar scenario could probably be decided with Toyotaro and Bird Studio, the studio Toriyama created a few decades ago after his initial success as a mangaka, and the workplace that has remained relevant to him since then. Dragon Ball certainly has the foundation to keep the franchise alive from the manga side of things. There's a natural heir in Toyotaro that has been working for years with Toriyama. And then there's Bird Studio, and also the people involved in the Dragon Ball room right before Akio Ioku shook things up a few months ago. Dragon Ball stopped being a one-man thing the moment it became one of the biggest hits ever within the entertainment industry. Yes, there may be difficulties and probably a lot of internal discussion, but Dragon Ball is nowadays a massive franchise that makes a lot of money each and every year. So even those that are afraid of a possible abrupt ending for Dragon Ball Super should remain calm. Dragon Ball as a whole is not going anywhere. The planification regarding when the Dragon Ball Super manga will come back is one thing on its own, but the content itself is a whole different beast. What were Toyotaro and Toriyama plotting right before the death of the Dragon Ball creator? We still don't know, but it seems like a safe bet to say that it was somehow related to Black Frieza. It's been quite a long time since Black Frieza was introduced as a transformation that had enough power to deal with both UI Goku and UI Vegeta, and since then the tyrant has gone completely silent. What has he been doing for 2 2 whole years, why do Goku and Vegeta seem kind of at ease while knowing he is out there and could strike at any given moment? Last we heard of Black Frieza, we were told that the villain had achieved a power level that put him really close to that of a god of destruction. It seems logical to think that the very reason that Gohan, Piccolo, and Broly managed to unlock and control new transformations was because they would have to deal with the most powerful enemy they had ever crossed paths with. Nevertheless, the ending of the chapter 103 in the Dragon Ball Super manga shows the Earth at peace, and with Goku, Gohan, and so on not really worried about any upcoming menace. Has something happened to Black Frieza we have not been made aware of yet? If not, the situation remains kinda confusing until further notice. There is also the Dragon Ball Daima premiere, and the fact that despite many theories and speculation, we also don't really know when it will happen within the Dragon Ball timeline. Will Dragon Ball Daima have some sort of effect in the current state of affairs, or will it be a story with no impact whatsoever in the grand scheme of things? It could go either way at this point. Regarding the Dragon Ball timeline, we mustn't ignore the fact that Dragon Ball Super superhero events were really close to what we know as the end of Dragon Ball Z. This may be the reason as to why Chapter 103 gave off that very peaceful vibe in spite of Black Frieza lurking around. But still, what back in the day looked really like an ending for Dragon Ball Z feels kind of out of place nowadays. Dragon Ball Super expanded on so many things when thinking of the old days, from power levels to the existence of a notable amount of universes, to the influence of the angels and the gods of destruction. Dragon Ball Super itself feels like a completely new universe when compared to Dragon Ball Z. Even if Dragon Ball Super takes place within the time frame of DBZ itself, everything Dragon Ball Super introduced throughout the years seemed to push away that peaceful final saga for DBZ. So much so that it looked possible for the new era of DB Super to change the story as we once knew it. To what extent is something entirely unknown, but the fact remains that the echoes of the Dragon Ball Super narrative are big enough to make it possible to alter what was once written on paper. Even if the end of DBZ had remained the same, the reality of it is that we were bound to push beyond those story limits for the very first time, or at least for the very first time with Akira Toriyama being actively involved in the creative process. Dragon Ball GT was a nice effort from Toei Animation, but the fact that Akira Toriyama had a secondary role in it was something that definitely had an impact in how the story was produced and received. Other than that, it is impossible not to wonder what Akira Toriyama had in mind when he introduced as many universes as he did in the beginning of Dragon Ball Super. The way he shaped the world of Dragon Ball back then completely destroyed almost every and any preconception we had about it. There were no limits, and the Tournament of Power worked as proof that there were a lot of powerful warriors elsewhere, new races, and even more Saiyans. Dragon Ball still possesses all that potential to explore new storylines, but the fact that such an expansion will unfold without the supervision of Akira Toriyama himself is certainly a sad conclusion. From what we had been told previously, it was Akira Toriyama himself who still decided the major story beats for Dragon Ball. The creator would provide a set of major events to happen in the story, and then both Toyotaro and Toei Animation had some free reign while deciding how those would eventually come to be. However, now that Toriyama-sensei is gone, it is finally time for someone to take over the Dragon Ball world, and that someone should definitely be Toyotaro. Although he has been working mostly as the main Dragon Ball Super illustrator, little by little Toyotaro managed to gain some influence regarding Dragon Ball story development and character creation. He most recently came up with the prequel for the Dragon Ball Super superhero arc, although with corrections coming from Akira Toriyama. Another major contribution from Toyotaro was Granola's final design, but he will obviously be forced to do much more story-wise from now on. There's also the possibility that other individuals such as Akio Ioku or even Victory Uchida could take a step forward and lighten the load for Toyotaro, helping him steer the story of Dragon Ball Super towards something Akira Toriyama could have come up with himself. There's obviously no way to completely emulate Toriyama-sensei's thought process when it comes to the Dragon Ball Super main storyline, but Toyotaro would do well to look for as much help as he can get, at least in the beginning of this new era. The reality of Toyotaro as a mangaka is that we still don't know his identity as one. Working alongside Akira Toriyama surely honed him in the ways of creating manga, but there's a big stretch from what he was doing to what he will be asked to do. The main question right now for him is if he will take on the challenge of creating both the illustrations as well as the main story. Because as much as others like Uchida-san or Ioku-san could intervene, they are no mangaka themselves. So could a new manga creator intervene in this time of need? The Toyotaro-Toriyama duo is certainly not the first one to exist in the world of manga. Yes, there may be some creators like Yoshihiro Togashi from the Hunter x Hunter series that prefer to do most, if not all of the work by themselves as hard as it gets. But there's others like Aka Akasaka from Kaguya-sama Love is War who understand just how tiresome it is to create manga. and so they end up deciding to split the work between art and storytelling. Akira Toriyama himself was more the latter rather than the former, and that's exactly how Toyotaro came into the spotlight eventually. The manga industry is a tough one, and weekly schedules are especially harsh with the creator, even if they are also the most rewarding ones when it comes to the popularity and success. If Dragon Ball Super was decided to be a monthly publication, it was probably due to a number of factors, and health was most likely one of them. Thinking of another popular Shonen Jump manga, Rui Dragon is one of the most recent hits at Shueisha, and it really didn't last long before Masaki Shindo, its creator, collapsed. It took a really long time for Shindo-sensei to recover and be able to start working yet again in Rui Dragon, but it was eventually decided that his comeback would be with a chapter every 2 weeks, instead of the craziness that it is to pump chapters weekly, even if they are obviously much shorter than monthly ones. Whether Toyotaro decides to do everything by himself now that he is in good health, or ends up trusting in another manga creator to help in keeping Toriyama-sensei's legacy alive, won't change the fact that he now has more power in the decision-making department than ever before. There's so much we don't know about Dragon Ball and the future of Dragon Ball Super at this point that the only thing to do is speculate about all the what-ifs and that may eventually come to be. Even if Toriyama-sensei was not in charge to greenlight and coordinate every little thing about the Dragon Ball franchise in this day and age, he most likely was the one to still decide on the most important stuff. In recent years, it was obvious that Akio Ioku, especially after the creation of Capsule Corporation Tokyo, had gained a lot of influence regarding the creation of content such as video games or anime movies from Dragon Ball. In that sense, it seems pretty obvious that Akira Toriyama himself was not someone really interested in the business side of things, but rather in content creation. Still, the new age of Dragon Ball will have to work even harder now in order to establish a new order of things. Before the passing of Akira Toriyama, but still in this very 2024, Ioku-san stated that they were preparing Dragon Ball content for at least the next 10 years. Again, given that Ioku-san had taken on the challenge of creating